A Bitter Taste by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 3.
An herb garden for a wall,
Will mused, reaching out to rub a leaf between his fingers, getting the warm scent of basil on his skin. The party was gaining in volume around him, but he'd seen no sign of the host. "In the kitchen," Matilda had said, in raptures over the unorthodox delight that was Hannibal Lecter. "He does all of his own cooking, and it is to die for." Will smirked a little, thinking that his own cooking was something people actually did die for. But he could hardly tell Matilda that. Yet. Still, it was frustrating to be here among the perfumed and plastic crowd, just as bored and annoyed as he'd been at Matilda's.
"Thank you for not bruising my plant."
Will caught that same delicious scent at the same time Hannibal's deep, pleasantly foreign voice reached his ears. He turned slightly as the man came closer, intent on reaching one of the plants growing along this unusual wall.
"Matilda told me about this,"
Will said, surprised to realize that Hannibal was just a shade taller than himself. He seemed larger, dangerous somehow, broad in his shoulders and trim in his hips, like a beast bred for fighting.
"I have to admit, isn't what I imagined. I'm sorry to disappoint you,"
Hannibal said, a slight smile quirking his mouth, but his attention focused on the plant he was so delicately snipping pieces off of.
"It is of my own design, for the sake of convenience, perhaps more so than beauty. Though beauty is always a consideration. Well, it is beautiful,"
Will observed, touching the wall to feel if its surface was smooth or raspy.
"Thank you for coming tonight, Will,"
Hannibal said, suddenly changing the subject as he finished his task, a generous bunch of thyme carefully gathered in a clean dish towel. He looked directly into Will's eyes, no reflection, no sign of himself looking back, until Will looked away.
"Did I say something to trouble you?"
"No, of course not," Will said, offering him an embarrassed grin, looking at him from behind the safety and screen of his dark lashes.
"I would remark on your difficulty maintaining eye contact,"
Hannibal said, just a hint of amusement in his voice.
"But then you might believe I was trying to analyze you."
"Well, you are a psychiatrist, so were you?" Will asked, grasping desperately for his mask of innocent guile. It was thrilling and alarming to be pushed out of his disguise so quickly and so often. He could feel his pulse picking up and saw Hannibal's dark gaze flick to the side of his throat, noticing it too.
"I would never be so rude as to say so,"
Hannibal murmured, bearing a hint of his sharp canines in a slight smile.
"You don't seem to be enjoying yourself. Have I failed you as a host so soon?"
No, not that," Will objected, and a heavy sigh escaped him, despite himself. "I'm just bored." Hannibal looked faintly offended, and Will hastily said, Not with you or the party, just in general. I mean, everything seems pale and lifeless anymore. Boring."
"Ah, the languishing grief of youth,"
Hannibal said, mollified by the explanation. He clasped Will's shoulder as he had that first night, the scent of fresh thyme on his long fingers, and urged him,
"Have a drink, Will. If you get too terribly bored by Baltimore's elite, there are many rooms to escape to. Feel free to make use of any one of them."
Will's brows rose on their own, wry disbelief coloring his voice when he asked,
"How do you know I won't rob you blind?"
Hannibal's fingers tightened just slightly on his shoulder.
"I expect you are better behaved than that, no matter your personal crises. Now, please excuse me, my sous chefs can only be trusted to a certain point."
Will watched him go, the scent of thyme slowly fading. He took him up on his offer, grabbed a glass of champagne, threading his way through the men and women who'd all gathered at the behest of Dr. Hannibal Lecter. Matilda was, thankfully, embroiled in discussion with several other people, giving Will a respite from her clinging. He got looks as he passed among them, some assessing, some indignant, some longing. Some of them he marked in his mind, labeling them according to their reactions, who to feast on, who to leave untouched. He made a game of it, sorting the sheep from the pigs from the rabbits. It amused him in as much as anything could these days. Well, until he'd met a wolf among the sheep, that is. Staff began to herd them into the dining room, where an incredible number of plates had been laid along an equally impressive table. Handwritten cards indicated who should sit where, who was lost in the flowers at the far end, accompanied by tapers in the middle, or graced with the presence of the doctor himself at the head. Will found himself seated at the head of the table, just to the right, a bewildering placement for a newcomer, but he was darkly amused to see the envy had won him, even if Hannibal's seat was yet empty. Matilda glared unhappy daggers from her place midway down, stuck between a slender young man and a portly politician. Will couldn't help but feel pleased by it, and just the tiniest bit grateful. Hannibal arrived to a round of applause, inclining his head in graceful acknowledgment of their praise for his beautiful table, laden with equally beautiful dishes. Will watched him speak, no doubt announcing what they were to expect, but he tuned it out to hear only the cadence and rhythm of his voice, a hypnotic sway of music divorced from meaning. He started slightly when Hannibal finally sat, looking down the length of his table like a king holding court. Even his profile was refreshingly unique, like an ancient Greek relief had suddenly become living flesh. Hannibal turned his gaze suddenly to Will, and searched him, perhaps reading some of the fascination on his face. The muted lighting in the room cast shadows beneath his high cheekbones, and pooled darkness at the corners of his mouth, leaving glittering reflections in his black hole eyes.
"You should eat, Will,"
Hannibal chided him, gathering up his silverware with an ornate flourish, turning his head just slightly to light his features again.
"You look rather pale."
Will watched him take a bite, relishing a dish of his own creation, and softly said, "I'm starving." Hannibal chewed thoughtfully, half of his attention on the conversations around him, the rest on Will himself.
"Then you've come to the right place, Will. 'Tis always my pleasure to feed the hungry."
Will dutifully gathered up his silverware, his old manners on this count more instinct than memory. The plate before him was almost too beautiful to eat, and he knew it wouldn't do him any good anyway. But he cut a small sliver of sauce-dressed meat and slid it into his mouth. His stomach made a sudden and ravenous demand for it before the full, luscious flavor had fully flooded his tongue. He cut another larger bite and managed not to tremble as he raised his fork to his mouth, eyes closing in utter delight as it did satisfy that awful, devouring hunger inside of him.
"It isn't often I see someone who enjoys food as much as I do,"
Hannibal said, and when Will opened his eyes he found the man looking at him, those dark orbs fixed on his mouth and then lifting to his own.
"You look less pale already, Will. I'm pleased."
His mouth curved into a shaky smile before he could stop it, all of his intentions and control laid waste by one meal at Hannibal Lecter's table. There was no mistaking this meat, however it was dressed and disguised. There was nothing on earth that could mimic the coppery, sharp tang of human blood, not even animal blood. Whatever was on his plate, on all their plates, had once been one of them, a sum of dreams, hopes, expectations, and disappointments, sewn into a casing of flesh and sliced into precise pieces to be garnished with their own blood as sauce.
"Tell me, Will."
Hannibal said, feasting as much on his responses as he did on the food before him.
"Are you bored still?"
"I am rapidly finding you very interesting, Dr. Lecter," Will said, unable to resist the tempting plate before him or the furious demands of his hunger.
"Please,"
he was told, those glittering brown eyes avidly watching him devour his meal.
"Call me Hannibal, Will."
It was course after course of satisfying food, satiating even Will's long-held hunger. Dish after dish, perhaps person after person? One thing he knew for sure as the dinner drew to a close was that Hannibal Lecter had a predilection for humans that extended far past just a preference for their company. It made him wonder, really, as he sat replete in his chair at Hannibal's right hand, watching as the man effortlessly charmed an entire table of society's eager best, if those sharp teeth he occasionally saw were like his own. It made him wonder if he, perhaps, was not as alone as he'd always believed, cursed and cast out and empty but for the hunger that always seized him.
"Are you feeling well, Will?"
Hannibal asked, solicitously moving his attention back to the young man at his side. He took a sip from his wine-glass, always just a sip, and added,
"You're flushed. Have you too much to drink? Should I have?"
Will asked, absently giving the incoming staff a short shake of his head to deny yet another top-off. Apparently, a glass anything less than half full was anathema in the home of Dr. Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal seemed pleased by his response, oddly. He even managed a small smile, just enough to curl the corners of his mouth, every subtle expression showing on his expressive face.
"You're a man, Will, are you not?"
he inquired, tipping his glass slightly toward Will.
I expect you to do as you please, knowing well enough what is best for yourself.
Will contemplated that for a moment before picking up his own glass and tapping it lightly to Hannibal's. They each drank, both of them hiding smiles behind the curve of their glasses, but never too much, never enough. "Hannibal, I can't tell you how disappointed I am to find my date so far from my side," Matilda called, masking her irritation in gentle chastisement. "Shame on you, you old rogue, monopolizing him like that." Will looked down at his plate, which was quickly whisked away by gloved hands and replaced with some sort of sorbet. He found himself wanting to eat it just to see how far Hannibal had gone with his culinary skills. Was it even possible to render a person into sorbet?
I do apologize, Matilda, but my guest list was already set when you asked me to accommodate Mr. Graham,
Hannibal said, unfazed by her rebuke.
The only seat I could offer was that of an old friend who, sadly, could not join us.
"I have to say, Dr. Lecter, that duck breast was astonishing,"
the man across from Will said, still dabbing his mouth with his fine linen napkin, turning the conversation without realizing it.
"Thank you, Dr. Caterson,"
Hannibal said, accepting the praise without modesty.
"He was an old friend who could join us."
A round of laughter filled the room at this perceived joke, and Hannibal looked extraordinarily pleased with himself, telling them over the tapering laughter,
"Enjoy your intermezzo. It would be sad to let the next course pass on a less than clean palate."
Will found himself profoundly amused by the whole evening, his seat giving him an uninterrupted view of Hannibal Lecter gleefully feeding these unknowing people one of their own, and, even better, accepting their compliments for it. He never imagined that someone like Hannibal Lecter existed, and now that he knew, he absolutely did not want to merely taste him. There were others in this town far less interesting and far more deserving of Will's last question. Because Hannibal might be like him, and Will could barely contain his hunger to find out. Dinner came to a close in the living room, where brandies made their rounds on silver platters borne by the impassive, white-liveried staff. Will once more found himself ensnared by Matilda's quick arm, and, apparently, couldn't keep the desperation off of his face. He was infinitely grateful when she excused herself for a moment, and he retreated to the fireplace, staring down into the flames, wondering where all of his quiet calm had gone. He'd intended to come here and seduce Hannibal, granted he'd never bothered to use his wiles on a man before. Seduce him into letting Will get him alone, and then feast on what would undoubtedly be the meal of a lifetime. But here he was, his belly full, his craving slumberous and calm in ways his awareness of Hannibal Lecter refused to be. He was so keenly attuned to the man moving through the room around him that he was already turning when Hannibal started toward him.
"Have you enjoyed your evening, Will?"
he inquired, resting one hand on the mantel with genuine affection.
"I see you don't have a brandy." "I have enjoyed it, and no, I don't have a brandy," Will said, hands in his pockets. "Neither do you, Hannibal." "I have appointments tomorrow," Hannibal responded, watching Will watch him in return. There was an intensity in his gaze that made Will think his seduction might not have gone entirely off the rails, a force to it that made him look back at the fire, the ghost of a blush on his cheeks. "Maybe he just wants to make a meal of me, too,"
he thought, and shivered with a strange sensation that might have once been pleasure.
"Should you like me to play Zeus to your Ganymede, Will?"
Hannibal asked, his voice falling to a purr, almost lost in the conversations around him. "If you intend to swoop down in the guise of an eagle and snatch me out of Matilda's hands," Will said, another spontaneous, unintended smile surfacing on the heels of a quick, brief eye contact, "then yes, by all means, please do." Hannibal smiled at him, revealing those sharp teeth again. Just the tips, just enough to make Will wonder. Would he ask his own question, make his own demands, or did he just take without asking, as was his due?
"Well,"
he said, turning his head to give Will the full vision of his fine profile,
"I will endeavor to snatch you from your fate, then, as it is currently closing in on us."
He reached out and took Will by his elbow. Will started at the sudden contact, but didn't pull away, despite his surprise. "William!" Matilda called, hurrying up to them with energy he secretly hoped she wouldn't have. "I'm dreadfully tired. Not to be a bore, Hannibal dear, but I must insist on reclaiming my date so he can escort me home."
"Ah, Matilda, forgive me."
Hannibal said, stopping as if he'd been in the middle of directing Will somewhere.
Will and I were going to have a discussion in private.
Private? She echoed, her gaze flicking from Hannibal's face to his hand, then back up to Will's face. He resolutely did not look at her. If he'd had his way, he'd never look at her again.
Yes, Will hasn't expressed an interest in my work,
Hannibal said, moving his hand from Will's elbow to the small of his back, a warm, confident pressure of palm and spread fingers.
I'm thinking of indulging in therapy,
Will said, taking his hint.
I will have one of the staff see you home,
Hannibal offered, forcefully propelling Will past Matilda, who looked stunned, irritated, and thoroughly bewildered by the turn of events.
Thank you for coming, Matilda. Your company is, as always, a pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine, she said, her voice carrying weakly in their wake.
You make a fine eagle,
Will murmured, allowing Hannibal to direct him to a discreet door panel that he slid open just widely enough to admit Will's slender form.
And you a fine Ganymede,
Hannibal told him, the pressure of his hand urging Will to go inside.
Your helplessness is quite fetching. I'm not entirely helpless, Dr. Lecter.
Hannibal gave him a genuine smile, fine lips parting over sharp teeth, and slid the door closed between them.
Not yet.